Why don't we get started?
I think that's
So, let me begin by welcoming all of you to the roundtable here, featuring a discussion of a very important book by our colleague, Professor Ajay Mehrotra, entitled "Making the Modern American Fiscal State: Law, Politics, and the Rise of Progressive Taxation, 1877 to 1929," published just last year by Cambridge University Press. As we all know, Professor Mehrotra is a nationally recognized legal historian and tax scholar who has many, many publications to his name. I won't go into all of them, take the whole hour. So I'll just move to our three guests who will be discussing his book, and our three guests are also of great prominence. Let me first introduce Professor Carolyn Jones from the University of Iowa. Now, Professor Jones holds the F. Wendell Miller Chair and is the former dean of the Iowa Law School. She is an extraordinary name in her field, specifically in the fields of tax law and the legal history of taxation. It's really a pleasure, Carolyn, to have you here with us. Our second guest is Professor Mike Grossberg, who's the Sally M. Riard Professor here at IU, with homes in the History Department, the Law School, and in Criminal Justice. Professor Grossberg is an expert on the history of law with a focus on family law, juvenile justice, and children's rights. And here, too, it's a great honor to have our friend Mike join us. And finally, Bill Popkin will be our third discussant. Professor Popkin is a Walter Foskett Professor of Law, who's really a legend in terms of in his areas of tax law, legislation, and statutory interpretation. So the plan here is to have each of the readers spend about 5 to 10 minutes discussing their thoughts on the book, and then we'll have Ajay give a short presentation, and then we'll open up to the floor. And finally, just on a very personal note, let me say that even though the Law and Society Center will be hosting one more speaker on Thursday, April 10th at 4 p.m., Professor Catherine Beckett from the University of Washington, Seattle. Today is the final roundtable and symposium of the year for our center. And for me, it's my final symposium as co-director of the Law and Society Center. As some of you know, earlier this semester, I've been doing a bit of double duty, directing both the Legal Professions Center and co-directing the Law and Society Center, but I'll be rotating off at the end of the semester here. So I just want to thank all of you for your great support over the past 3 years. Ethan and I had some huge shoes to fill, taking over for Mike and Ajay. In fact, as I was remembered last night at dinner, quite rightly I should add, those were the golden years. But I'm just really happy at how the community, and especially the students, have so strongly supported our events over the past 3 years. And this event is really testament to that.
Hey, Jay.
So for that, let me just say that to end with the program here that honors really our special and dear friend Ajay, with 3 equally amazing panelists, is for me just a great way to go out. So I'll turn it over to Carolyn and thank all of you for coming.
I think, did you want to go first?
I don't care. I can go.
Why don't you go ahead?
I guess I'll go first.
We have a...
Right, no, this is being
Good afternoon.
Right.
It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion today and to talk about this book, The Making of the American Fiscal State, Modern American Fiscal State. We all know that tax law and tax policy is important. It's important in the present. It's been important at critical moments in the past. We've learned that our revolution begins with patriots throwing tea in the Boston Harbor to protest British taxes, and is carried on with the cry of no taxation without representation. I think that Ajay's great achievement in this book is making us realize that not only is tax policy important, and not only does it have an important past, but that one of those moments, the creation of the federal income tax, is itself a consequential tale. A tale full of pivotal events, a large cast of characters, fierce ideological battles, intense bureaucratic conflict, and even a triumphant conclusion. And not only all that, but that all of these are crucial to modernity as we experience it now. Who knew that? Who knew that tax policy could be so interesting? We're all waiting for the movie, I think. So what I want to do is just introduce this book, which I assume a couple of you haven't read, by highlighting the main story, suggesting why I would argue it's a very significant story, and then ending with some questions about what I take to be the moral of the story. And so let me begin by just saying that like most important works about the past, Ajay addresses a story we thought we knew. In the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, they passed an income tax. It goes away in the conflicts, the bitter, bloody conflicts of the late 19th century. The idea of an income tax comes back. It's dashed by the Supreme Court. The idea resurrects itself and is passed through a triumph of progressive reform. Ajay chronicles how this is a much more complicated tale. He talks about the shift from what he calls a regime of indirect, hidden, partisan, and regressive taxes towards this new regime of direct and graduated taxes. And he demonstrates very clearly that this change was neither easy nor inevitable. And I think he makes it clear that it occurred not simply because of the need for revenue, not simply to raise money to fund policies, but because of broader concerns about equity, what he calls fiscal citizenship, bureaucratic authority, and economic justice. And it seems to me he makes this in a persuasive way in a number of fashions. First of all, he gives us, like, again, most historical arguments do that are particularly compelling, he argues that there are multiple sources for this change. Social movements, state and local reformers, political and professional elites, changing ideological convictions about the state and tax itself. And I think what's one of the most important parts of this book and most compelling is the way he understands ideas and ideology and how they're put into practice. In this book, we not only see alternatives, paths not taken, Henry George's single tax, which may haunt some of you from history textbooks you've read and as an undergraduate, but more importantly, progressive economists who he calls, like Richard Ely, he calls the visionaries or architects of the American fiscal state. And then there are other kinds of arguments that build to make this case persuasive. For example, though the focus of this book is on the federal income tax, it is also a story of federalism. He makes it very clear that activity is going on in the states, not simply at the national level. And it's the combination of state change and federal change that creates the climate for this sort of innovation. And that helps us understand someone like Louis Brandeis. Brandeis lives in this world. He will later draw from this world in a 1932 opinion the really powerful concept of states as laboratories. Ajay gives us an example of states as laboratories. We can see it in the present in issues like same-sex marriage. He also, I think, shows very clearly the role of lawyers as state builders. And he emphasizes this construction role of lawyers and legislators and jurists in the production of tax law and policy. He also charts how that leads to a kind of bureaucratization and specialization by talking about the emergence of a federal tax bar composed of government lawyers, private practitioners, and those who go back and forth between working in the government and working outside of it. That is itself part of this new fiscal state. And then finally, to give a sense of how he makes a persuasive case, Ajay's book is yet another example of how critical state construction projects have taken place in this country during wartime. War is a cauldron for state creation, and in this case, it's World War I, in which the actors in his book create this new fiscal state. They pass something like the excessive profits tax, which not only seeks to raise revenue, it not only seeks to find some kind of way to cap the war munitions industry that's being created, but it tries to articulate a sense of the collective good and the link of taxes to it, and thus becomes part of this project. So the result of all this is the creation of what Ajay calls the modern fiscal state. And that transformed American governance, not merely American state policy. It is a watershed event, and this book helps us understand why. So it seems to me that's the story. I think it's a significant story, and like all stories, it can be told in multiple ways, it can be given multiple meanings. Part of this idea of the new fiscal state, I assume, has implications for my other colleagues on the panel who study tax and tax policy. I won't go there, I'll just let them do that. I see its implications as a historian, because it seems to me that making the modern American fiscal state is a major contribution to our understanding of the past, and thus the construction of the present. In particular, it seems to me that Ajay's study of the federal income tax is a contribution to an emerging field that's reviving interest and understanding of the roles of institutions in social and economic life. And indeed, Ajay is a leading actor in the construction of what has been called the new political or the new policy history. And that is itself a reaction to the past, like this book shows. If you will indulge me, what choice do you have? I'd like to take you down a little bit of history lane here and say that for much of the 20th century, American history was dominated by what's known as the presidential synthesis. The idea was that change occurred because of what happened in Washington. We marked the change with labels like the Age of Jackson or the New Deal or whatever. And embedded in that was an assumption of change from the top down, from Washington out. And then amid the upheavals of the 1960s, one of them is in the way we come to grips with the past, and a rejection of this idea and an assertion that there are more actors involved in the past, women, African Americans, labor, a variety of things, as well as a different notion of social change. Change comes from some interaction between different people at different levels of government. That idea is powerful. It leads to whole new ways of understanding the past. One of its limitations is that it starts to denigrate the study of American politics, because that's the target to get rid of. And so one definition of what becomes known as the new social history is history with the politics left out. In the 1990s, when Ajay is getting his BA, getting his JD, going on to graduate school, there's a growing sense of the limitation of this approach, and particularly its failure to account for power, and its failure to recognize the hold of political belief and practice. And the slogan emerges, we need to bring the state back in. And this leads to a new kind of political history that recognizes the ordering authority of institutions, the dynamics of the policy process, and the significant but bounded role of individuals as agents of social change. I would argue that Ajay's book is both a product of that new policy history, and now it's a source of that new policy history. And I think you can see that when you read the book, if you have not done so yet, and the way he recounts the complex interplay between ideology, legal development, politics, and social activism. Just to take one example, the book is filled with actors, many of them elites, elite lawyers. But I think almost all of them would agree with Lincoln when he said, in the midst of the war, I must admit that events controlled me far more than I controlled events. And that's the image that you get from this book. You understand the role of individual agency, but you also understand it bounded by professionalism, by belief, by institution, and those kinds of things. And that's the kind of rich history that I think this is, and that makes it a major contribution to this new emerging field. I expect that this book will be held up as a model of how to write this new kind of historical scholarship, and that it will cement Ajay's role as a leader of this new field. And I do want to stress that I believe that this is not a history just for historians, that it's for those who want to understand the present as well. To use a phrase from the period that Ajay studies, what he's done here is create a usable past. And I think it can be used by many people in many ways. And that leads to my final point. How do we use it? Like all significant works of scholarship, it seems to me that this book answers many major questions, but in doing so raises other questions. And let me just note a couple that intrigue me. One is that though the book pays a lot of homage to these academic economists, and indeed in some ways they're heroes of the book, crusading academics are a very appealing figure to many of us in this room. It seems to me that the real heroes of this story are a cadre of lawyers. The book portrays lawyers as social and political engineers operating in their own realm, separate from the masses, from radical reformers, from plutocrats. And it's they who build this new fiscal state by resisting alternatives, and particularly by taming what seems to be a redistributional current in the society at the time. Ajay tells us their triumph is not inevitable. I certainly agree with that, but it did happen. And so we need to think about what it means to understand lawyer-led reform as a distinctive solution to the challenges of this era. Particularly because there is a body of work in socio-legal studies that questions the limits of lawyer-led legal change, including changes of this period that are kindred to this, like the emergence of legal aid or workers' compensation. They too were created by lawyers. They too were part of this new modern state. It's not clear to me exactly how Ajay balances the costs and benefits of this professional project. In one way, it can be read as a kind of heroic example of what we now might call cause lawyering. These lawyers negotiate through this minefield and come up with a solution. In another way, it can be a cautionary tale about the reforms that lawyers lead can tame powerful social forces like redistribution. And there are other ways that, well, I wonder how he reads that. I also wonder about what I think is one of the more fascinating concepts of this book, fiscal citizenship. It tells us that it was a fundamental part of the conceptual shift in this period, and that it takes hold of popular consciousness by the 1930s. I wonder how strong that hold was and how contested its meaning, since he also tells us, again very persuasively, that taxing was not simply a tool to raise revenue for particular policies, but it was a means through which Americans could talk about their vision of government and civic responsibility. We know, for instance, that there is a high income tax compliance rate in this country. We also know that there have been fierce fights that continue, not just about levels of taxation, but also about the use of tax money and even the very legitimacy of federal taxing authority. After all, we live in an age of another Tea Party. In my own research on American political and legal history, which includes watching The Daily Show, I see ever-present clips of Fox News commentators going on rants about particular uses of tax money. One of the recent ones was a complaint about food stamps, that chronicle the abuse of tax money by food stamp holders, including the decision of people apparently to buy organic salmon in the East Village of New York with their food stamps, apparently rather than canned tuna, I'm not sure. But it makes me wonder about the range of meanings of fiscal citizenship and why there have been continuing doubts about the legitimacy of what is now not so new a fiscal state and its implications. I wonder just how deep the commitment to collective responsibility through taxation is in what I would argue is a fundamentally anti-statist polity, and thus how transformative the changes chronicled in the book might be. The book raises many other provocative questions. I'm sure they will be raised here. I just want to conclude by saying that I think making the modern American fiscal state convinces us that the creation of the federal income tax was a clear and major turning point in America's state of development, and that it still orders our life today. Given the calendar, I can't resist saying that this book, this session today, also gives us a new understanding of the impending April 15th income tax deadline in a new and appreciative way. And I think we should all congratulate Ajay for that achievement. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Maurer School of Law and Jay for his work on making all the arrangements. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to say Ajay's book is a truly wonderful piece of scholarship. It displays superb research and a truly humane approach to its subject. And it's a genuine pleasure to read. So for those of you who are not tax devotees, as perhaps those of us at this end of the table might be, I do encourage you to read it. There's so many themes in this book, but I'm going to take one thread and talk about teaching tax and what it means to teach tax, because to some extent that's what this book is about. And it's a conversation I've had with the book as a tax professor, a law teacher, and someone interested in tax history. And unlike you, Mike, I feel the leading actor in this book is an economist rather than a lawyer, and I have to engage in some self-examination as to why it is I'm not so persuaded about the lawyers as the leading men in this book. But it is E.R.A. Seligman, a political economist at Columbia. And Seligman wrote in his Essays in Taxation, if the history of taxation teaches any one lesson, it is that all social and moral advance is the result of a slow process. And while fiscal systems are continually modified by the working out of ethical ideals, these ideals themselves depend for their realization upon the economic forces which are continually transforming the face of human society. It's because he writes like that that he truly is one of my favorites. And I think, as Mike has sketched, the economic forces in the progressive era were truly transformative. We had rapid industrialization, urbanization, labor unrest, immigration, and, this may sound somewhat familiar, inequality of incomes. And there was a great demand for more government services at every level, local, state, and federal. And the old system of government finance, tariffs, alcohol and tobacco taxes, selling public lands, and the property tax were simply not up to the task. People came to see the tax system as unfair, heavy and inescapable for the poor, eminently avoidable for the rich. And Making the Modern American Fiscal State expertly describes and evaluates the arguments for tax reform and its disparate advocates. So we go from bimetallism with William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold to socialism, and Milwaukee had a socialist mayor during this time, with municipal utilities, and, as Mike mentioned, Henry George's single tax. And Seligman sardonically described the single tax. He says, land is the creation of God. It is not the result of any man's labor. No one, therefore, has a right to own land. Private property in land is undoubtedly the cause of all social evils. It therefore becomes the duty of the government to take what rightfully belongs to the whole community. Everyone may retain the result of his own labor, but the value of the bare land, the economic rent, must be taken for the state. In this way, and in this way alone, can the social problems be solved. Now, a single tax enthusiast actually created the game of Monopoly, and it was called the landlord's game. And the chance cards were quotes from Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Carnegie, and the properties included Fifth Avenue, Wall Street, Broadway. And instead of go, the space was labor upon Mother Earth produces wages. There were two ways to play Monopoly. You could play it the way it has come to be played today, as a competition to the death, where eventually people are bankrupted. Or you could vote to do something allowed in Monopoly, cooperate. And under this alternative rule set, you could pay land rent not to the title holder, but to a common pot, which would simulate the single tax, and prosperity would be achieved. So this is one way of teaching tax, but it is not the way celebrated in Ajay's book. The progressive economists were, at the very beginning, they were first-rate learners. And many of them crossed the Atlantic to do graduate work in Germany, which was home to approaches to taxation and social benefits that were very different than those of the laissez-faire state. Rather than using deductive principles, their German mentors called for historical and statistical treatment. There were no immutable economic laws. Theories and institutions interacted at different times in different places in different ways. So there was no landlord's game where people keep trotting around the same board with the same rules applying. Their argument was that there was nuance and contingency and a need for careful evaluation and consideration of the transactions that were being shown. And that ethical ideals and economic forces were transforming society. I think that book centers, and here I'm going to differ a little bit from Mike, I think it centers on the academy as the main law teacher in this time. And Seligman was sort of the pater familias of American tax scholars. And I was so pleased, Ajay, to see you writing about Vassar economist Mabel Newcomer, a Seligman student and one of the early women economists. Unfortunately, some women economists who were trained by Seligman or his compatriots found themselves teaching tax not in economic departments, but rather in the new discipline of home economics, where you do find some teaching of tax principles. Beyond the burgeoning world of higher education, there was more teaching to do. And as Ajay writes, for these progressive intellectuals who became interested in public finance, overcoming the chasm between highbrow theories and the material world of the masses meant educating lawmakers, policy analysts, and the broader public about the need for dramatic fiscal reform. It might mean educating Governor Charles Evan Hughes of New York about how efficient capital markets might price in the tax-exempt nature of state and local debt. Seligman was quoted as saying in the New York Times, "If any of my students at Columbia had made the same mistake as Governor Hughes, I should have flunked him dead." As Henry Carter Adams put in explaining his choice to leave the seminary and become a political economist, he told his father his calling was providing the voters of this country with a political education. It is the work, he said to his father, it is work of a lower order than dealing directly with the souls of men, but it is work which a follower of Christ may do. Making the modern American Fiscal State shows legislators educating constituents, lawyers educating lawyers, and law students. And I wish there had been more about teaching law in law schools, but this is a 409-page book, so I realize that there is much that we would like to know that can't possibly be included. And the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the predecessor to the IRS, training its burgeoning staff. We also have World War I propaganda efforts with the Creel Committee and using clergy in the effort to sell people on buying bonds and paying income taxes. Two themes of this book stand out in my own encounter with it in thinking about teaching tax. First, Ajay brings the full range of taxation into view, state, local, federal. And the progressive economists and lawyers thought that progressive taxation was really promoting equal sacrifice, but we were dealing with a whole panoply of taxes. So some were regressive, some were progressive. So what we've done with our targeted tax curriculum, I think, is overemphasize certain types of taxes without keeping the whole field in view. And one thing that I think of was when I began teaching tax, I got a copy of Boris Bitker's 4th edition, and it lopped off state and local tax, which was a disadvantage, but it included corporate tax, the state and gift, partnership, and individual income tax, all in one volume. So you could sort of see how the entire system worked together. And I think that that's led to some misperceptions where we think that many Americans do not pay taxes. We leave out social insurance, which is a major source of revenue for the federal government currently. So this book is very suggestive about how important it is to think about a full range of taxing options. The other thing is that we're just past the 100th anniversary of modern federal income tax. And Seligman would probably notice contrasts between his time and ours. He wrote of the future success of progressive taxation in America. He said it rested not on economic theories, but on the state of social consciousness and the development of a feeling of civic obligation. And I really have to read, Ajay knows, this is my favorite Seligman quote. And it seems like it's the pronouncement of an alien, perhaps, in today's world. Seligman says, "It is now generally agreed that we pay taxes not because the state protects us or because we get any benefits from the state, but simply because the state is a part of us. The duty of supporting and protecting it is born with us. In a civilized society, the state is necessary to the individual as the air he breathes. Unless he reverts to stateless savagery and anarchy, he cannot live beyond its confines. He does not choose the state, but is born into it. It is interwoven with the very fibers of his being. Nay, in the last resort, he gives to it his very life. To say that he supports the state only because it benefits him is a narrow and selfish doctrine. We pay taxes not because we get benefits from the state, but because it is as much our duty to support the state as to support ourselves or our family, because in short, the state is an integral part of us." That is a very different notion of the modern American fiscal state. What Ajay has done, and the most stunning point made in this book, the one I keep thinking about most often, is the notion that there was it's a critique of these heroes of progressive taxation. And that is that they focus so much on a fair taxation system that they never developed a theory of how to spend money. They focused on equal sacrifice rather than redistribution. And so today we have many questions, the size and activism of the state, of makers and takers, that we are still resolving in our time. I think that Americans still support progressive taxation, but it's fair to say there's less support for steep progressive taxation. And lessons from progressive tax reformers with regard to institutional capacities and competencies could be taken well in our time, where I think we see some real glitches in the administration of tax laws. To be perfectly honest, this is my favorite book of tax history in recent decades. And it is smart, it's informed, it's balanced and well written. I want to thank you, Ajay, and I want to thank all of you for coming to hear my thoughts about this really wonderful book. You're lucky to have its author among you. Thank you.
Almost everything I wanted to say has been said. This is one of the curses of going last. I think what I'll do is pick up on one thing Carolyn just mentioned, which is, for me, the most startling thing about modern policy, and that is the way the ability to pay idea that had been developed as the theory behind progressive taxation somehow got disjoined from the notion of government spending. I think you refer to this, Ajay, as an unintended consequence. And it's certainly something that has always occurred to me while I was doing my own tax stuff. I think Galbraith, for example, a liberal, probably some of you have no idea who he is, but was in favor of a sales tax, as I recall, because he did not believe in this disjunction. And one of the curious things for me has always been why on earth this happened. One of the consequences that I was brought up on was that earmarking of taxes was bad. You couldn't tax in order to spend on a particular program. Well, why not? It seemed to me that was a very good way of selling a tax, but the idea of the disjunction between the duty to contribute and the sense of, and here's the key phrase, the sense of community, which would allow spending as well as the duty to pay taxes to somehow be conjoined, somehow that was lost. And I'm not quite sure why that has to be true. One of the things that this book made me think about, and I've got nowhere really with it as yet, is why the benefit theory of taxation, which was an impoverished contractual notion, as Jay puts it, couldn't also have been developed into a theory of community. I vaguely remember one of my contracts teachers talking about how you can't have contracts between people unless there is a sense of community between the people who are making contracts, perhaps contrary to the way in which law and economics people think of contracts. But it seems to me that, especially if you, the key word in Ajay's book is contingency for me. If you think of all these things as contingent, as maybe developing in one way or the other, I'm not sure why the benefit theory couldn't have evolved in a particular direction, although it clearly did not. Now, what else can I mention that has not been mentioned? I wrote down three basic things. The role of ideas, which of course to an academic is just wonderful. The role of lawyers, which of course to lawyers is also wonderful. The third thing, which was briefly mentioned, is the administrative structure. And it seems to me that that can bear a lot of emphasis, perhaps more than the others had mentioned, and I think it comes through very clearly in the book. The role of the lawyers was very much to build up this administrative structure, without which perhaps none of this would have survived in the way that it did. And it helped to solidify the acceptance of the income tax. Now, one or two other things I just want to mention. After the World War I was sort of brought up, not being much of an historian, that was a period of retrenchment. One of the really interesting things in Ajay's book is how, yeah, sure, there was retrenchment, but not complete retreat. And the development of an explanation as to why this was not that much of a retreat, I think to some extent because of the role that the lawyers played, and he details, I won't take time to explain the details, but the development of the Board of Tax Appeals in 1924, 26 is an example of that, where that solidifies the existence of the income tax. And another thing that he comments on that as a legislation teacher has always struck me is the role of, as soon as you see treatises written on something, you know you made it. And this happens with legislation in the late 19th century. American statutory interpretation had its own treatises, and Ajay reminds us of a lists a lot of these treatises. All right, lastly, well, there are two things. Reagan, 1986. What happened? There's a story there that your book made me think about, and I don't know much about it. There was the middle ground. I mean, it lowered tax rates, but it got rid of is too strong, but reduced the impact of tax shelters. It was this way and that way, very much like the 1920s that Ajay describes, where you had retrenchment, yeah, but you also had no sales tax didn't come back in the 1920s and so on and so forth. The Reagan Internal Revenue Code of 1986, the use of that phrase is very significant. Perhaps none of you pick up on that, but it was called an Internal Revenue Code, which means they thought it was significant. And why did Reagan take that view? Now, Ajay concludes the book, whether he wanted to or whether they told you he had to, I don't know, but some implications for today. And that really also got me thinking. Yeah, we tend to think that the loss of community today might threaten the existence of a lot of the things that Ajay talks about. I think one of the most significant impacts of what's happening today that might cause that is to go back to what I said about administration. We don't trust institutions anymore, and it's not just the government, it's the Catholic Church, it's all sorts of institutions. And it may be that the mistrust of institutions, rather than the decline of of administrative institutions, rather than the decline of the ideas that Ajay stresses, that might, in this era of contingency, we don't know which way it's going to go, might cause it to go in a particular direction. One of the events that he talks about was, I didn't know this, the 1911 New York ratification, which only occurred because the Democrats overwhelmingly swept in to the governorship and the legislature in 1911, and that, I don't know, I guess it would have passed anyway, but he used to treat that as a significant event. All right, flash forward to 2016, who's going to control Congress, and whether that will have, road not taken, which road are we going to take, an impact on the evolution of some of the, will we really get a flat tax? Will we really get a consumption tax? I highly doubt it, but I suppose those things could be on the table. And the last thing that it made me think about was Obamacare. Sense of community is what it's all about, and if it is true that the disjunction of the duty to pay taxes and the failure to worry about spending is what happened with the income tax, it's the same thing's happening with Obamacare. This lack of a sense of community is depriving us of certainly a single payer approach and a lot of the attacks on Obamacare, and the lack of attention to the administrative structure, which was paid attention to the income tax, is perhaps dooming Obamacare. And I will stop there so Ajay can respond to that.
Wow, that was a terrific set of comments. Let me first thank Jay and Ethan and the Center and the law school in general for hosting this event, for all of you coming out here. A lot of you have seen this work evolve over time in a very slow and incremental fashion, and have really contributed to it. I want to thank all my friends and colleagues and students. I foisted drafts onto seminar students for many years, and had many research assistants that learned a lot more about fiscal policy than they ever signed up for. And so I'm very grateful. This is not an individual product, but really a project that comes from Indiana University through and through. So thanks to everyone. And then I want to thank the panel members for making the time to read a book so carefully. I mean, all three of these folks, as Jay has already suggested in his introduction, are very important folks. Carolyn is really, she's too modest to mention this, but really a pioneer in this field in writing about the history of American fiscal policy. And she mentioned the World War I propaganda work that I did. That was just me liberally cribbing from her World War II work, in which she, I think in this really path-breaking article, talks about the social effort that went into convincing people to pay taxes to fight the Axis, with Donald Duck employed as an important spokesperson for the U.S. government. And so it was that model that helped me in World War I. And Bill and Mike, like many others, have been very gracious with their time over the years, and they've probably read just about everything I've thrown their way. And so I thank them for all their mentorship throughout the years. Let me very briefly just respond to a couple of quick things. I want to leave some time for questions. I know we have just an hour. One on sort of who the heroes or villains are, whether it's the economists or the lawyers. And I think the answer is both. They are both critical to the story, and they're both heroes and villains, at least the way I've tried to tell the story, in the sense that I do try to start with the material story, because it is social movements at first that are pushing for this in the early parts of the chapter in the late 19th century that Mike has already talked about. But it really, I do focus on this particular group of progressive era economists, all of whom were trained in Germany. So this is not a story of American exceptionalism. There's a transatlantic flow of ideas that are going on in this time period. And what these academics try to do is really sort of harness the social movements and give them a language, a frame, a cognitive map. And I use this term ability to pay, which is now every tax casebook you use begins with this early chapter about ability to pay and Haig-Simon's notion of income. Haig, Robert Murray Haig, who is Edwin Seligman's prize student. And so I'm kind of tracing back this notion of ability to pay. And so the economists are an important point, but it's not just a story about ideas, at least I hope it's not. It's about ideas in action, and that means lawmakers. So in addition to lawyers, I'm trying to look at the legal profession more broadly. So it's not, so there's a particular chapter on treasury lawyers, these sort of Wall Street Republican kind of anti-status folks who get pulled into the Woodrow Wilson Treasury Department and become convinced that you ought to have, when you're fighting a global war, you ought to have a pretty effective and administrative tax system. And so they become transformed. So the lawyers are critical there, but lawmakers are important to all this. So Cornell Hull, who's considered the political grandfather of the income tax, plays an important role in moving from the realm of ideas in the academy to lawmaking itself. And then the lawyers, I think, I like to think come in the last third in particular, or the lawyers in particular that Mike was referring to, kind of the cause lawyers, as well as the 1920s in this period of quasi-retrenchment, as Bill has pointed out. I refer to it as the paradox of retrenchment, because there's a sort of superficial retreat in the 1920s, but yet there is still this administrative buildup from the war, the ratchet effect, as social scientists often refer to it after the war, that maintains this kind of continuity and in fact solidifies a lot of this. So I'd like to think it's as a story of social movements and political economists and legal professionals and the role they play as state builders in all of this. There are several other things that were mentioned. Let me just pick up on one in particular that Carolyn and Bill pointed out to. When an author writes a book, you never quite know what the reader's going to take away from it. And I certainly wanted to try to reach a broad audience of not only historians who are interested in the Gilded Age and progressive eras, but tax professionals or tax academics who might not have an interest in the history but are concerned today about tax reform. And so in some ways I may have committed the cardinal sin of professional historians of being too presentist, but Mike's always been good about reminding me about the importance, as he said today, about a usable past. And one of the things about the usable past that came to me is towards the later stages of writing the book, in fact, because it came from a comparative perspective. When I started doing some more comparative evidence, one of the glaring things that the U.S. lacks from a comparative scale is any kind of national consumption tax. If you look at OECD data, the one thing that just conspicuously stands out is the fact that there is no value-added tax or some kind of consumption tax. And so, as I was still working on this book, this was kind of lurking in my mind, and the connections that Bill was talking about started to come together. This notion that these political economists and lawyers who gradually became wedded to exalting the notion of ability to pay, in the process had to denigrate what was the existing theory, the benefits principle, that we pay taxes to get a direct benefit. But the benefit principle came with a real virtue. It actually talked about tax and transfer, tax and spending in a holistic sense. By definition, the benefit principle had that intact. And when these economists and legal professionals attacked that and tried to replace it with a notion of ability to pay to support the notion of a progressive tax, they severed that link. And this is what I describe as sort of fiscal myopia, the sort of the generation of a fiscal myopia that gets exacerbated over time. And that, I think, was my presentist push. This attempt to sort of help us think carefully about trying to overcome that myopia, trying to think more broadly about tax and transfer policies together rather than and this also comes from thinking about the modern question, why no consumption tax in America, right? Why no VAT in the US, which is sort of the tax scholars' version of the Werner Sonnenberg question, right?
No turnover tax.
Why no turnover tax? Why no socialism in America? This is sort of is the appendage to that. And part of it, I think, is this intellectual movement that tacks on to other things. It's not just about ideas, and I do try to synthesize some of the other work that looks upon this. But that was my attempt to really to try to pull in a presentist aspect of it. And so to get your specific question, Bill, about why couldn't the benefits theory do that, I'm not sure. I mean, substance, part of this is about historical sequence. And that was the dominant rationale that had to be taken down by the progressives. Certainly by the 1950s, you mentioned Galbraith, it's Richard Musgrave and Nicholas Caldor who are also saying, well, wait a minute, why do we have to have an ability to pay rationale for tax? Why couldn't we have a benefits principle that would have this sense of community? So it's there, but it's the old Mark Twain line about history not repeating itself, but certainly rhyming, right? It's coming back in some other way. So I want to leave it at that and open it up for, we have time for questions,
Of course,
Jay?
yeah,
You think
please.
2 minutes, 5 minutes?
Please, we'll open up the floor.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So in teaching tax, do you really not talk about FICA? Or did I mishear that?
There's a
Yeah.
lot more teaching of tax to my right here, but
We
we
don't.
don't. It's the federal income tax. This
Right.
was how we focus specifically on, there's enough to cover on that issue than to get into FICA and other. We mention it, but we don't.
But your point is a good one, because that's a tax that is earmarked supposedly for a purpose. It doesn't actually fund the benefits. But it does have, as you were talking about, Bill, the earmarking notion.
Yeah, right.
And so people are tremendously attracted to it. And Roosevelt said, I'm going to call it insurance so that no damn politician can ever take it away from people.
Well, this week there was the Quality Stores Supreme Court decision released, which is a FICA one and very important, I guess. Anyway, be good for your students.
Bill?
It sounds like a fantastic book. One always says I have to read it this way, I have to read that. Looking forward to reading it. But just listening to the presentations, what struck me is you seem to be bringing together lots of different sort of theoretical traditions, right? So there's an argument about state making and war making,
Yeah.
an argument about state and culture and ideas, an argument about state and professionals, lawyers, other kinds of modernizing elites. There's nothing wrong with bringing together those different theoretical traditions. However, they are arguably different theoretical traditions, Weberian, others. So maybe you could talk just a little bit about which of those traditions shaped the book, why you went there.
Yeah, so I was trying to engage with several of those, and maybe not sufficiently to satisfy people from those. So the Warren, let me start with the Warren statement. As you know, the classic Charles Tilly line is war makes states, right? And this is what I think Mike referred to as the kind of, I call that the sort of the functionalist school, right? It's a very structural functionalist argument, right? There's this, Tilly and all these other social scientists take, I don't know, 2,000 years of history, right? And they find these kinds of independent variables that then, dependent variables, and it's terrific stuff. And I think there's a lot to be said for war and taxes, and as Mike has said, World War I plays an important role as a pivot for my story. So I don't mean, but I think it's a lot more complicated than that, right? So this is the typical historian's response to the social scientist, right? That it's not just one independent variable. And so in fact, I try to show that if you see the foundations that are laid, they're all laid well before World War I, right? It's 1913 that the 16th Amendment is adopted and the first income tax is enacted as well. And so that, and then the administrative foundations that others have talked about, all they certainly blow up. There's clearly a ratchet effect from war. There's no doubt. I'm not trying to question that part of it. But the sense that it's a sort of simple functionalist, structuralist response is one I didn't quite agree with. So that's one. On the, let me tie in Mike's point about the professions and social change. And so I guess I am trying to tap into that socio-legal literature that Mike's talking about cause lawyering, but mine is a kind of different kind of cause lawyering. Often cause lawyering, we mentioned the Legal Aid Society, and things like that, it's cause lawyering from the left, right? It's social movements. And so in a sense, there's also a cause lawyering from the right that's occurring. And this is in my chapter in the 1920s, but there's a paradox to that. And so this is Bill and Carolyn referred to this. If you look at the treatises that are created in the 1920s and the Macomber case, which I do spend a good amount of time, this is sort of a canonical case. about the income tax. These are all attempts to kind of whittle down the scope of the 16th Amendment, but yet in the process they're creating this administrative structure that is actually bolstering it, right? So there's this, so even the kind of conservative cause lawyering has this kind of unintended consequences in this 1920s period, right? By actually solidifying the role of the income tax in this period. So that's two of them. We can talk more, Bill, later maybe about some of the others that you mentioned. But you're absolutely right. There are a bunch of different theoretical constructs that I'm trying to deal with. Again, probably not sufficiently.
Just to be impolite, everybody be very polite. Why isn't that eclecticism? Excuse me. Why isn't that problematic if you're bringing together all of these different?
I don't see it as problematic. I mean, so I guess it would be problematic for someone who's, you know, I think Charles Tilley might be upset that he might argue I put too much straw on my straw man, right? That's not exactly what he's saying, but that's certainly how I read that work. And so but there's parts of it that I think are valuable. The ratchet effect is hard to argue against. You look at just about every country, and you look at just about every, you know, you see the charts, right? You see what happens after war. There's this dramatic change in state power after wars, and it rarely goes back to the pre-war levels. That's hard for me to question. But the fact that what are the variables that lead to that, I think are multifaceted rather than just one or two.
After looking at the creation of this fiscal state, how does it change your view on going forward as we look to, you know, make the tax code more efficient, eliminate some of this waste as we've created these vast code that is, you know, and we have tons of lawyers and tons of accountants that are spending millions of hours a year. That's probably not the most efficient use of their time on this tax code. And how does your view on how it's created influence what will happen going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know if I've got any specific prescriptive advice in this book. It's a work of history. It's meant to provide the long view, some perspective. So I don't know if I've got an answer to how we can come up with that, a better tax system, a less complex one. That's not exactly it. But what I'm trying to show, and I think Carolyn and others have pointed this out, is and Bill has suggested this by referencing the 86 Act, right? Reform is possible. Right? This is the other, so in a sense this is a lament of a lost period, right? So it gets to Mike's question about the durability of this notion of the collective or physical system. That's probably gone. I mean, I don't mean to be so Pollyannish about it. And in fact, in the conclusion, I think I do point out that certainly by the 1960s and 70s, there's this the dissolving of the social, right? Whether you call it bowling alone or the age of fracture, right? There's clearly lots of evidence of that. So I don't mean Pollyannish, but there is some inspiration we can take, I think, from this earlier period in which we had very similar kinds of concerns that we have today. Rising inequality. I mean, this was one of the sort of fundamental impetuses in the Gilded Age, right? We are now in a new Gilded Age, right? The second Gilded Age, as Paul Krugman reminds us every week, right, is upon us. And so with these kinds of contexts and circumstances, I think reform might be possible. So I don't know if that's a sufficient response to the specifics of your question, but I'm trying to provide some perspective on when reform did occur in the past and might occur again.
What was the case where Hughes said something silly?
It wasn't the case. It was the 16th Amendment. And Hughes said that as governor, he was opposed to it. He was opposed to the New York State ratifying it. And he made some arguments about how it would affect the yields on state bonds, potentially. And he gets the capital market efficiency arguments wrong. And that's what Seligman really hammers him on. That was the great quote about. He was a student of mine, and they were actually classmates, Seligman and so they're old friends. They actually went to Columbia Law School together.
Okay, well, I want to thank our
Thank you all for coming. Thank you.